Good morning, Colorado. This is, again, the Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission. This is our weekly business agenda. It is Thursday, February 24th. We will initiate with a roll call.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Commissioner Bogue.
Here.
Commissioner Gonzalez.
Here.
Commissioner Hackett. Commissioner McGowan.
Here.
Commissioner Mesner.
Here.
Commissioner Nanjapa.
Here.
Commissioner Robbins.
Here.
Mr. Chair, you have 6 out of 7 commissioners present today.
Thank you very much. Good morning to everybody. Good to see you again. Seems like we just were together. Oh, we were. With that, we will move into our agenda. We have 2 matters docketed this morning, 2 oil and gas development plan applications. The first is docket number 210800138, Larimer Energy. And the order of play will be public comment, followed by Laramie presentation of the OGDP, followed by commissioner questions and deliberation. With that, we do have 5 people that have signed up to provide public comment on the Laramie OGDP. I understand that the first individual that I should call upon is Sarah Lloyd.
Hi, my name is Sarah Lloyd. Greater sage grouse have experienced historical population declines, especially in peripheral populations like the parachute peance roan sage grouse area, or PPR. And this species have been extirpated from approximately half of its pre-settlement distribution. In their 2015 listing decision, U.S. Fish and Wildlife identified energy development as one of the main concerns for greater sage grouse. This concern is due to long-term habitat loss and modification due to oil and gas development. U.S. Fish and Wildlife in 2015 cited multiple studies that reported greater sage grouse avoidance of oil and gas developed areas and declines in indices of greater sage grouse abundance in oil and gas fields. Greater sage grouse are without a doubt our canaries in a coal mine. The Cascade Creek OGDP is the first decision for the Commission under the new rules involving this critical and rapidly declining species. Our staff has done an exhaustive review of past and current peer-reviewed and other research on greater sage grouse, much of which covers PPR area and the OGDP site. Many of these studies were conducted by CPW's own scientists and other colleagues from the USGS. The science is very complex, the level of detail and uncertainty is highly variable, and the degree of confidence of map units is not uniform from one area to another. CPW's own researchers tell us that what is mapped as general or priority in one area may not be at all equivalent to another study area. In terms of incorporating best science towards management decisions, especially for a species like greater sage grouse, let's take a look at how CPW, DNR's wildlife experts, weigh in. CPW was a signatory member on the Colorado Sage Grouse Conservation Plan and Steering Committee along with all major federal agencies. The purpose of the Colorado Plan was to facilitate the conservation of greater sage grouse and their habitats in Colorado. Decisions were arrived at by consensus. The written guidelines as agreed to by CPW state that adaptive approaches should be used and best available science should be applied when implementing these guidelines. The same written guidelines relative to greater sage grouse disturbance state that, quote, whether seasonal habitats are unmapped or mapped, if there is overlap of different seasonal habitats, whichever seasonal recommendation are the most restrictive should be applied, end quote. A 2020 USGS report by Peter Coates and others summarizes most recent peer-reviewed science on disturbance in greater sage grouse. Coates and others cite multiple published studies that find that disturbance buffers around leks must encompass all of the seasonal habitat, not just breeding. To accomplish this, these studies recommend buffer distances of 5 to 8 kilometers out from the lek to protect all seasonal habitat. Further, the Colorado Plan that CPW was a member recommended a 6.4 kilometer buffer around leks. While CPW was a signatory author of the Colorado Plan, called for implementing best scientific practices, and thus a 4-mile buffer from leks. What we find is something completely contradictory in the new rules in 1202C. Rather than following best science, the HPH for greater sage grouse is only 1 mile from leks year-round. CPW's HPH table is indirectly referenced in Rule 1201B, and even there, best science is not applied, as no surface occupancy as applied to general habitat, and thus high priority habitat for greater sage grouse is only 2 miles from Lex. This is a far cry from best science and is in direct conflict with CPW's own management policy. Thank you.
Thank you. Sorry. Next, we have Dana Bovey.
Commissioner Robbins, may I be able to share my screen?
Yes, we can enable you to share screens.
Okay, thank you. As I said, I think this will go. I tried to keep it to 3. It could go to 4. I'll hurry through. Just wanted to give you a heads up, but I think I can squeeze it in there.
Okay, and we're not going to get started until we can make sure you screen share, if that was
You bet. Okay. All right. There's my share. Do you guys have that?
We do.
Okay, thank you. So I'll go ahead. My name's Dana Bovey. I'm with Front Range Eagle Studies, and along with Sarah. Sarah's one of our staff members, and I'll just proceed. So we now like to address issues of noise relative to the northernmost of the OGDP pads, shown over here on the slide. And that pad would be 232 feet from mapped high priority habitat. These are the general habitat areas, or GHMA, is shown in the figure. CPW's HBH table for mapped general habitat areas reads the following, quote, limit noise to not exceed 49 decibels as measured 30 feet from the source, end quote. Thus, standing at the edge of the mapped general HPH habitat, or the GHMA area located right in through here, just 232 feet from the pad, in order to protect this HPH habitat, the noise from the northernmost pad should then not exceed 49 decibels. Our hope is that each of the commissioners will recall our group's documented testimony from the Dreamweaver petition hearing. In that testimony, we documented a 1-hour logarithmic average of measured noise from the Dreamweaver pad during well stimulation with sound with 1-hour averages of up to 65 dBA. Those measurements were reported 1,970 feet from the Dreamweaver pad, over 8.5 times the distance between the northern OGD pad and nearby mapped high priority habitat. But rather than agree to evaluate the impacts of noise on HPH originating from the northern OGDP pad, as would indicate an interest in a best science perspective, CPW and the operator dismissed the notion of any further consultation or modeling of noise impacts on the HPH, which would emanate from the pad at only a stone's throw away. CPW's response to this matter was, quote, as it relates to greater sage grouse, noise from anthropogenic sources is most harmful during the lekking or breeding season. They further stated that, quote, the noise levels that the operator must adhere to within table 423 are not drastically higher than what CPW recommends to avoid impacts to nearby sage grouse breeding areas, end quote. As a reminder, CPW's HPH noise ceiling for impact on mapped general habitat, or HPH, is 49 decibels. However, decibel is a power ratio, not a linear scale. So in actuality, Garfield County's 85 to 90 decibel noise ceiling under Rule 423B is in fact drastically higher than CPW's recommended 49 decibel ceiling for this mapped high priority habitat. CPW has a written commitment to guidelines that follow best scientific practices as a signatory of the Colorado Sage Grouse Protection Plan. Yet here we find that CPW considers noise to be of most concern in only 1 out of 3 major seasonal habitats for greater sage grouse. That's breeding. Thus, in this analysis, there's only a focused concern with respect to distance to the lek or breeding habitat, with no expressed concern for protecting the other 2 seasonal habitats that are present in this OGDP. CPW's own mapping documents that HPH, priority in general, is bisected by the main access road to the site. And once again, HPH will be as close as 83 to 232 feet from the OGDP pads. However, we believe you'll hear from CPW that their own mapped HPH habitat at this OGDP in reality has little value for greater sage grouse. Researchers in our organization have done an exhaustive review of mapping and science pertaining to this OGDP. We have consulted with other scientific experts to evaluate the science and the mapping. Our takeaway from CPW's mapping and CPW and USGS peer-reviewed studies is that the OGDP area does, in fact, contain favorable habitat for greater sage grouse. Further, 2018 co-authored studies co-authored by USGS and CPW researchers indicate that portions of the OGDP had predicted potential for lek sites, particularly along the haul route that bisects both the HPH along the way to the well paths. I'll just show that if I can really quickly here.
Mr. Bove, just so you know, you're significantly over the 4 minutes. So
Okay, I got about a minute. So I won't go there. I'll just say, outside of our concern for this OGDP, we're worried about how the commission will evaluate the next sagebrush habitat that comes up for OGDP development. It is very likely that the next one will also contain the same HPH units, but the possibility also arises that these same HPH map units could, in CPW's opinion, encompass more favorable habitat than that present at the Cascade Creek OGBDT. So perhaps in the next application, these same HPH map units might have more granular detail or resolution. Yet still these areas could very well share the same HPH map units as those mapped in this particular OGDP by CPW. Will we fail to see a thorough and scientific look at the potential impact and disturbance to this incredibly sensitive species, or the boxes simply be checked once again, with the overarching motivation being towards giving operators the opportunity to develop versus making good data and sound science and protection of this very fragile species, the motivation? Sorry for going over. Thank you for hearing me.
Thank you. Thank you for being with us this morning. We appreciate it. We now will hear from Brad Clayfun.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. May I be allowed to share my screen, please?
Certainly. Ms.
Thank you.
Larson, if we could allow Mr. Clayfun to share screens.
yes. Mr. Clifton, if you just select the share screen icon, you are enabled to do so.
Thank you. And let me start the slideshow. All right, great. Thank you very much. My name is Brad Payne. Together with Joanne Hackos, we are representing Audubon Colorado Council, Colorado Chapter of Sierra Club, and Wildlife and Biological Resources Coalition. This application near Quebec presents a number of precedent-setting issues for you. These go beyond the greater sage grouse to issues of consultation with BLM and whether you will allow local zoning for noise to take precedence over your own rules. Also, given your mandate to protect air, water, soil, and biological resources, we ask you to consider using this moment when Laramie wants to spend millions of dollars to drill 65 wells in a declining gas field, as you see on the slide, to reclaim on an accelerated schedule disturbed areas and grouse habitats which have been damaged by previous oil and gas activities. Laramie Energy in Garfield County has, by my count, 2 outstanding NOAVs, 4 unresolved spills, and 10 inspection failures. To protect wildlife and the environment, how can this application be used to remediate past habitat destruction? So to the area, CPW map priority habitat is shown with hatching. The red circles are the 4 locations in this OGDP. The haul road comes up 1,400 vertical feet from Cascade Creek to the left. And as it proceeds through the pads, it runs through priority habitat. Notice the road, as well as general grouse habitat shown in brown. This road will carry all the traffic needed to drill and maintain the 65 new wells over a number of years. It is going to be heavily used. The road is in high priority habitat as mapped by CPW. Rule 423B4 says, when operating in high priority habitat, operators will consult with CPW and BLM to determine acceptable noise limits and monitoring protocols. That has not been done here. Rule 423B4 should apply. The applicant has placed the drill pads and waste dump just outside the designated habitat boundaries. To CPW, the applicant, and COGCC staff, that seemingly precludes any consideration of off-site indirect noise impacts on the grouse habitat. For example, excuse me, the director allowed a lesser impact exemption for the 29,000 cubic yard waste pit, which is 83 feet from general habitat and 1,300 feet from priority habitat. Another noise issue concerns preemption of your noise rules by the more permissive local governments. Garfield County has zoned this area as industrial, meaning noise could reach up to 80 decibels. If the designation were rural, the limit would be 55 decibels, a huge difference. In fact, CPW's HPH recommendations are for 49 decibels. Yet staff says you must defer to Garfield County. We feel this is an error. According to the rules, you commissioners may defer to Garfield County, but then you must find that the industrial noise standard is as protective of the environment and wildlife as the rural standard, or CPW's HPH standard. Noise of 80 decibels may also be able to reach the LEC buffers. The applicant has not proven that it won't. This application, like others on the Western Slope, involves the BLM. They're doing an environmental assessment on this proposal now and have required a biological assessment, which is complete. Yet neither of these documents are in evidence here. You are supposed to be coordinating with BLM, but staff is not requiring submission of the already completed biological assessment. Staff is also saying you can make a decision before BLM issues its EA. This isn't right. Both the BA and EA should inform your decision-making process. Failure to coordinate with BLM and review their information has already led to the bulldozing of 53 Harrington's Penstemons by TEP on the pad you approved in September. This is clearly shown in the BLM EA and biological assessment, but you did not see them. You need to benefit from BLM's reviews and not act before you consider all of their information. Finally, I want to address the appropriate standard that you should use for assessing impacts. The applicant, both here and in the TEP case, made the argument that population impacts on Penstemon or grouse are the only level of impacts you need to consider. Population level impacts. This population level impact argument has turned into the industry mantra, but it is deeply inconsistent with the mandate of SB 181 to protect wildlife and the environment. Grouse numbers have been decimated by incremental human action, by death by 1,000 tots, none of which individually reach the population level, but which do cumulatively. The population level impact standard perpetuates this flawed reasoning and will lead to still greater impacts on all wildlife and biological resources. Population level impact is the wrong standard. Two more sentences, if I may. We urge you to postpone a decision on this application until you review the biological assessment, review the BLM environmental assessment, resolve Garfield County's preemption claim, do a thorough consultation on noise as required by Rule 423B4, and hear from academics who will update you on the science behind noise impacts on non-lekking habitats needed by the grouse. Please use your mandate to protect the environment and wildlife by requiring reclamation and restoration of habitat as part of this proposal when your leverage is greatest, as it is right now. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for being with us this morning and for sharing your thoughts and concerns. We now will hear from Joanne Hackus.
Okay, can you hear me now?
We can.
Okay, thank you. As Brad said, I'm representing Audubon Colorado Council, Wildlife and Biological Resources Coalition, and Sierra Club Oil and Gas Committee. I'm also, of course, from Evergreen. And I might point out people at Evergreen care about the rest of the state, but you may not think that's true. Young sage grouse, we know, do not return to a lek that is close to a gas field, even if their parents had used that lek. Of course, the leks and gas fields have declined precipitously. Why do the birds leave? Oil and gas chops up the landscape, increases the noise from drilling and truck activity, and adds power lines and structures that provide perches for predators. Balancing land and resource use with greater sage-grouse conservation is difficult. At this point, leks have been the primary focus of conservation and management. However, the focus on leks is short-sighted and will result in the continuing disastrous decline of the species, a species that is clearly not mediocre, as we've been told. Protection at the scale of individual leks is not sufficient. There is an increased likelihood of sage-grouse population persistence if the identified primary and secondary source habitats are left intact. Population success is the result of both lek activity and the activity of nesting and raising chicks that takes place in areas in suitable habitat through the sagebrush ecosystem. If primary source habitats are maintained intact, they may provide dispersing sage-grouse to occupy disturbed areas when they are reclaimed. Of course, they have to be reclaimed first. Greater sage-grouse is North America's largest grouse, characteristic feature of big sagebrush in western North America. It was observed by the Lewis and Clark expedition and was widespread. Its population densities have been greatly reduced to loss of habitat from cultivation, oil and gas development, burning, and overgrazing. Most populations face problems that may take or long-term problems that continue despite a century of conservation concern and management effort. The dramatic physiological behavior nature of the greater sage-grouse has been an inspiration to people throughout North America. Species is renowned for its displays, its large numbers at lek sites. The primary cause of decline is habitat alteration. And the causes of mortality include all of the things that everyone has been mentioning to you this morning. There's evidence that an increased level of noise from oil and gas operations has a cumulative negative effect on their populations through reduced habitat. Oil and gas drilling presents special problems because it invites in aerial predators, and the rigs and equipment provides tall structures that those predators can use. to prey on the sage grouse. Colorado Sage Grouse Plan requires that the state prioritize the leasing and development of fluid mineral resources outside of greater sage grouse habitat. The state has an obligation to lease outside of this critical habitat. Requires the state assure a net conservation gain using compensatory mitigation when its actions disturb greater sage grouse habitat. Sage Grouse Plan in 2015 makes clear that limiting leasing within a mile of active leks is just one part of a suite of key components that you've heard about this morning. The state must defer any actions affecting greater sage grouse until it has met its obligations to comply with the 2015 Colorado Sage Grouse Plan, including the net conservation gain standard and use of compensatory mitigation. The state must also require that an environmental assessment be completed to review the impact of oil and gas drilling on the land. Predictable consequences include water contamination, vegetation loss, erosion, sedimentation, noise, wildlife behavior modification. The EA must be completed, as we've heard, not after, but before the lease is granted. Thank you very much. I hope you have some questions for Brad, Dana, and I, and others who are speaking about this morning. Thank you.
Thank you. Why don't you all stick around and we'll see if there are questions. Now we'll hear from Eric Mulvar.
Hi there, my name is Eric Mulvar. I'm the Executive Director of Western Watersheds Project. I'm a wildlife biologist published in Moose Ecology, but I've spent the last 20 years working on sage grouse and often in the context of oil and gas development. And I'd like to encourage the Commission at this juncture to follow the best available science when it comes to setting the bar for sage grouse habitat protections in the context of oil and gas development. The first item I'd like to speak to is the impact of noise on sage grouse. There's been a lot of research on noise and sage grouse, and it's my understanding that the Commission is considering waiving the 49 dBA or decibel threshold that the Colorado Parks and Wildlife recommends. But even the 49 decibel threshold is far too high to sustain sage grouse populations. And this has been known for a long time. The 49 decibel threshold came from 10 degrees or 10 decibels higher than the ambient. And according to Patricelli and others in 2013, in a study that was titled Recommended Management Strategies to Limit Anthropogenic Noise Impacts on Greater Sage Grouse in Wyoming, Patricelli and al. Pointed out that there is evidence that 39 dBA is not an appropriate estimate of ambient levels in sage grouse and sagebrush habitat. This value originated in a 1971 US EPA report from a single afternoon measurement from a farm in Camarillo, California. And this farm location in Camarillo, California was within 160 yards of a residential street, 0.6 of a mile from a state highway, 3.5 miles from the Santa Paula Freeway. And quote, during the day, an orchard pruner in the distance controlled the minimum sound level. So this 1971 39 dBA threshold is what everybody has been using as background noise. That's completely inappropriate for sagebrush habitats. The controlling best science comes from Ambrose and others, 2021, a study called Sagebrush Soundscapes and the Effects of Gas Field Sounds on Greater Sage Grouse. And this was a critical test of the hypothesis of what threshold can sage grouse sustain in terms of noise. That study found that the actual background level for noise in sagebrush habitat, the natural noise level, is 14 decibels, 14 dBA, not 39 dBA. So we've been using the wrong threshold for many years inappropriately. And these researchers point out, and I quote, the higher the sound level, the greater the likelihood of a decline. Thresholds above which declines occurred were LAEQ of 31 decibels, and LA50, which is the background or the noise level that's there 50% of the time, of 26 decibels. LECs with LAEQ greater than 31 decibels and LA50 greater than 26 decibels, 10 and 91% respectively, had declining trends. Our findings suggest that the current policy of limiting sound levels at LECs to LA50 less than 10 decibels or LAEQ less than 15 decibels over the background sound level being 14 decibels, is appropriate if an accurate background level is used. So in other words, the threshold you should be applying to your projects in sage grouse habitat should be 24 dBA, not 49 dBA. And as pointed out by an earlier commenter, it's a logarithmic increase of noise as decibels go up. It's not linear. The next thing I'd like to talk about is the appropriate thresholds for setbacks for sage grouse habitat. The controlling best science comes from Matt Holleran's 2005 PhD dissertation, which was performed and funded by the oil and gas industry and the Bureau of Land Management in the Pinedale, Anticline, and Jonah fields of western Wyoming. And it found that that within 1.9 miles of access roads that access 5 or more well pads, that sage grouse numbers, populations declined. When there was an active drilling rig within 3.1 miles of a sage grouse lek, that populations declined. And when there was a completed and just sitting there natural gas well pad that was just a completed well pad that was producing within 1.9 miles of the lek, there were population declines. Furthermore, this research spun off information indicating that sage grouse nest within 5.3 miles of sage grouse leks. There was an analysis done by the USGS in 2014 by Munir et al., finding that the interpreted range of appropriate lek buffers was 3.1 miles to 5 miles, not 1 mile, not 2 miles. So I would recommend that the Oil and Gas Conservation Commission follow the best available science and apply more stringent standards to oil and gas facilities that are permitted within sage grouse habitats. Thank you very much, and I'd be happy to stick around for questions if desired.
Thank you. Commissioners, at this point, that is the conclusion of public testimony. I would ask if anyone has questions of any of the speakers, we can bring them back to the table. Commissioner McGowan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I'm hoping that I know we're going to have someone from CPW participate later as well, because I've had some questions reading through the OGDP. I have to admit, I'm having a little trouble understanding this biological assessment EA that is upcoming but not yet completed, and how that fits into the decision that we're supposed to make. And the timing of it. And so if these folks have some more information about what that biological assessment is going to include and when it might be completed, I would appreciate some information.
Very good. With that, I believe next on the agenda would be a presentation from Laramie.
Thank you, commissioners. My name is David Little. I'm an attorney for Laramie Energy in this matter. I work at Steptoe and Johnson. My co-counsel is Diana Prouillard. Wayne Bankert is the regulatory and environmental manager for Laramie Energy, and he will be coordinating the presentation today with Katie Middleton, who's a consultant who's working with Laramie Energy on this matter. Of course, we'd like to thank you, the commissioners and the commenters, for their comments today. I would note for the record that Laramie Energy did receive written comments that had been prepared by Brad Claffen and Jan Heckos, and did have a chance to respond in writing in a letter dated January 14th to those comments. Laramie has not received written comments from Dana Bovey, Sarah Lloyd, or Eric Mulver. Our understanding is Ms. Lloyd and Eric Mulver signed up to speak today after these previously scheduled February 16 hearing. So we'll do the best we can to respond to those comments and any questions that the commissioners might have. In addition, we do have 5 other witnesses who are on the panel today and available to answer questions for the commissioners as well. Mr. Bankert.
Thank you, David. Katie, can you bring the presentation up, please? Ms. Larson, I think you'll probably have to.
The screen share is enabled, so
Thank you.
any panelists can go ahead and start screen sharing.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, David. Good morning, commissioners. Again, my name is Wayne Bankert, and I am the Regulatory Environmental Manager for Laramie Energy. Since 2007, I have been the project manager for siting and permitting for all the location facilities and wells for Laramie Energy. Okay. Next slide, please, Kate. Thank you. Laramie Energy was founded as a limited liability company in 2004 and as a private equity LLC and an exploration development company, operated solely in Western Colorado in the Piceance Basin on private BLM and forest lands. The asset acreage is primary in the Plateau Valley, also known as Coburn Valley, and the White River and Grand Mesa Uncompahgre National Forest. From 2004 to early 2007, Laramie drilled and completed wells and installed infrastructure in these areas. Early 2007, Laramie sold their assets to Plains Exploration, and the core management group created Laramie Energy 2 LLC, now known as Laramie Energy, and implemented the same business plan as before to drill both exploratory and infill, complete and install infrastructures. Since 2007, Laramie has acquired acreage and wells of 7 different operators, including Delta Petroleum, which was acquired through the bankruptcy proceedings. In 2016, Laramie acquired Oxy USA assets in the Cascade Creek operations, where this OGDP is proposed. Currently, our core operating areas are the Plateau Valley and the Cascade Creek in the Piceance Basin in western Colorado. We currently operate about 1,455 wells in 3 counties, Mesa, Garfield, and Rio Blanco. And we do have a plug and abandonment well program in process where we've plugged in the last 5 years 68 wells for an average about 14 wells per year. And we do have an ongoing plugging program as wells reach their end of life. On this Cascade Oil GDP, Laramie's tried to minimize surface impacts by utilizing constructed well pads and previously disturbed lands. This OGDP reflects scope and cumulative impacts of the proposed operations for the next 3 years within the proposal boundary. A total of 4 locations are proposed, 3 well pads with 67 directional wells. 65 of those are new wells and 2 are existing producing wells. And we also are proposing a cutting management area to be permitted as a centralized E&P waste management facility. As you can see from the table below, the new surface disturbance acreage for the entire project is roughly 12.32 acres. And after interim reclamation, long-term disturbance for the project area will be 6.7 acres. As the three pads in the cutting management area, are connected in close proximity to each other, it only made sense for Laramie to permit them as a group. This is basically what our OGDP drilling schedule looks like for the 65 wells and 3 pads. Even though the 2141 will be scheduled to commence prior to the 2332 pad, we just put these in order in reference to the OGDP application. As you can see, we intend to commence second quarter of this year, contingent upon approval date of the OGDP and associated drilling permits for the 61021-41 pad. Katie, thank you. What you see here is a very abbreviated flow diagram of the thought process and planning that goes into selecting a site prior to even preparing an application for submittal. You might say this is the alternative location analysis Laramie conducts prior to submitting an application. Even though until recently, the location analysis was completed informally inside the company. As is evident from this slide, there is a great deal of thought and analysis that goes into selecting a site even before we start preparing the applications for submittal. This slide just illustrates the timeline with key dates and preparing and submitted the OGDP, as well as the Form 28 application for a centralized E&P waste management facility. As you can see, Laramie started this planning process in November of 2019, and we're here today in front of you, in front of the commission, presenting our proposal. Some of the benefits of this OGDP are that the OGDP is located in an established operation area with existing infrastructure, including access roads, gathering lines, and water infrastructure. The access to the site, to Laramie's 10,530 acres of surface ownership, is through the gate you see in this photo. Beyond this gated access, only Laramie authorized personnel, contractors, one other surface owner, and regulatory agency personnel are allowed. During daylight working hours, this gate remains open and is locked and secured after hours. In addition to the gated access, security cameras are installed for monitoring ingress and egress to the Cascade Creek area. In addition, we do have support facilities behind there. We have a water treatment facility. We do have saltwater disposal wells to accentuate our projects. Okay. Thank you. So some of the benefits are, some of the positive characters of GDPR, the proposed locations are outside of mapped high priority habitat buffers, are located greater than 3 miles from residential building units, high occupancy building units, school properties, school facilities, childcare facilities, designated outdoor activities, and is located greater than 9 miles from the nearest public road and public access, as you've seen in the previous slide. The locations, none of the locations met the criteria for Rule 304B2, so an alternative location analysis was not required for any of them. Okay, thank you. This slide illustrates, but it's not all inclusive, some of the technology and BFPs that will be implemented to minimize impacts for all of the proposed sites. Laramie prepared multiple plans, including wildlife management, light and noise, water and stormwater, etc., to mitigate and minimize the impacts of the OGDP program. Katie, please. This is a aerial of the Cascade Creek 0603 23-32 pad. The access road you see going around the pad is actually the main access for the Laramie operations. There's an existing pad with two producing wells that will be temporarily abandoned during the expansion, drilling, and completion of 24 new wells on the pad, for a total of 26. The pad is to be expanded to roughly 6.7 acres and reclaimed back to plus or minus 3.2 acres for the long term. I think this video is an excellent depiction of the topographical challenges that Laramie and other operators have in siting pads and installing infrastructure with the least amount of surface impacts possible in the area. As this is immediately adjacent to our main access road, as you can see, very limited construction for roads will be required for this pad. Please. This is the Cascade Creek 610-2141 pad. It's an existing new pad that was expanded in 2019 for a 16-well development. The pad was re-engineered in 2020 to accommodate an additional 7 wells for the total of 23. This pad is built, as you can see, this pad has stormwater BMPs installed around the pad and requires no additional surface disturbance for development. The location assessment for this was approved in February 2019, and the location assessment just expired February 12th of this year. Existing disturbance for this pad is 7 plus 7.0 acres. And once drilling completions are done, the reclaimed acreage will be back to 1.7 acres, plus or minus. Thank you, Katie. This pad is the 697-1508 pad. It's an entirely new pad. It will be constructed adjacent to an existing pad. And Katie, I'm sorry, but I lost my slide here. Hang on just a second. This pad is 18 new directional wells, 15 fee wells, and 3 federal wells. After consultation with BLM, I apologize, I got disorganized here somewhere.
I'd be happy to continue the presentation. This is the only location in the Laramie Cascade Creek OGDP that will be a totally new disturbance. The 0697-1508 will be tied and adjacent to an existing location. During the assessment, BLM with COGCC and Laramie decided that a new location versus expanding the adjacent existing location would actually result in less surface disturbance. Since developing on the adjacent existing pad would require the pad to be significantly cut down. The efforts to minimize surface disturbance is also that Laramie is planning on developing and constructing the access road for this new location on the existing and adjacent pad. The pipeline will also be installed on the access road within the access road shoulder, also limiting surface disturbance.
Also, just Katie, if you go back to that, also, if you notice there, this is the pad that has federal wells on it. And so BLM is preparing an environmental assessment. In communication with them, they expect the decision record to be completed by late March, as per. And so I think it's important to note that on this location, we had multiple consultations with BLM, COGCC, and CPW regarding the location of this pad, and actually had site visits prior to any preparation of plans. And the consensus was made that this site would be better and least impactful to the area if we established a new pad than the old one. Thank you. Katie, thank you.
This is the Annex cuttings facility. This will be permitted under a Form 28 as a centralized EMP waste management facility for the development of a non-commercialized drill cuttings treatment and disposal site. No liquids or free fluids will be stored at this site. Due to topography limits, the management of drill cuttings cannot occur on the 3 proposed OGDP well pads. So Laramie is proposing to haul the drill cuttings to this location. As you can tell from this video, Laramie is proposing the location on previously disturbed surface. This proposal will not result in any additional disturbance of native lands. The site will be 2.9 acres and the working pad surface will be 0.6 acres. After final reclamation, all of the acreage associated with this facility will be reclaimed. The benefits of the Annex cuttings facility will be to reduce truck traffic to the nearest EMP waste management facility, which is approximately 28.5 miles from the project area. This will keep all the cuttings and EMP waste haul routes within Laramie's property and within the OGDP proposal area. Also, by allowing the cuttings to come to this facility, it will keep the OGDP well pads at reduced acreage sizes.
Thank you, Katie. So the next 3 slides are computer generated 3D visual representations of the proposed cuttings management area that were created in the very early stages of the planning process, just showing the existing site topography, the site during construction and operations, and the site after operations after completion and final reclamation. Here's what the cuttings and construction is, sort of a visual representation of what the facility would look like. You have a burn spoils piles on the left there, the cuttings management area where the trucks would haul in the material cuttings, and the access road to the cuttings. I think it's important to note also that these drill cuttings are the same cuttings that you would see on a permitted well pad. And due to the size of the well pads, as Katie mentioned, it was determined by Laramie that a cuttings management area, a centralized area like this, would actually reduce the impacts of expansion of the other pads. And that's why we proposed this area to store excess cuttings and treat them and encapsulate them here at this site. Thanks, Katie. This is what it would look after final rate claim. It would be after closure and after operation completed, it'd be recontoured and reshaped to try to meet the natural topography, and then it would be reseeded and revegetated as planned. What you see here is the 2 different haul routes that we would be looking at. On the public haul route, if the cuttings management area was not approved, that would be the haul route that would be taken. As you can see, it's roughly 28.5 miles, and it would go through the town of Dakota, plus several public, would on be public road through the town of limits of Dakota. And on the right, you see the public access road as it on the right, you would see the access road if the cuttings facility was approved, and it would be just up on the surface on Laramie's private access property. And here you show as a visual representation of the 2 and how they would interact, or basically what the access road on the right, if approved, compared to the access road on the left if we were not approved and had to haul to Greenleaf. Thank you. So finally, this is just a ending of the side. We just wanted to give some of the technical staff review comments of, health, safety, and welfare considerations, and resource considerations, wildlife resource considerations. And during this process, plans and figures went through numerous iterations as mission guidance documents were prepared. And Laramie is appreciative of the staff's assistance, guidance, and time during the OGDP application process. Laramie worked with several government agencies during the planning of completions at the application stage. The COGCC, the BLM, and the CPW and Garfield County all provided crucial guidance and recommendations for this project. So we're going to end this slideshow just with the director's recommendation of recommending approval of this. And again, we just want to thank the commission and staff for their time and deliberation of this proposal. Thank you.
Mr. Bankert, I had one other issue that I wanted you to address. There was a question about the status of the BLM review and the associated work associated with that. Would you just add to your comments on that?
Sure. We've been discussing with the BLM and been in communications with them. They are preparing an environmental assessment for the project for the C 697-1508 pad. The EA is completed. It's in review at the moment. And we expect a decision record, or the BLM has communicated to me that they expect a decision record by mid to end March. Was there additional, David, or?
No, I think, when did you last check with the BLM on the status of the matter?
I contacted Alan Crockett, which is the mineral support specialist at the BLM in the Colorado Valley Field Office yesterday morning, which would be the 23rd. So we've been in constant communication with him, just checking on the status of that EA and how it's progressing.
Thank you. That concludes our presentation, and we're available for questions.
Great, thank you for the presentation. Commissioners, are there questions? Commissioner McGowan?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I feel like this might be a little out of order, but I'm wondering if we could add the CPW representative, because I have some questions about how habitat gets determined and why or why not some things that were considered or not considered that were submitted by some of the conservation stakeholders. And I'm wondering if Mr. Elm wouldn't mind talking a little bit about the difference between the two types of sage grouse habitat and the proximity of the proposed sites, and how the consultation went with the applicants and how some of the decisions were made. It would help me kind of then guide me for some questions if other commissioners are okay with that.
I think that's fine. Mr. Elm, if you want to introduce yourself and answer Commissioner McGowan's question, that would be great.
Thank you, Chairman Robbins and Commissioner McGowan. My name is Taylor Elm. I am the Energy Liaison for Colorado Parks and Wildlife for the northwest corner of the state. I've been in this role with CPW for approximately 9 years now. And I apologize, Commissioner McGowan, as I transferred to panelist, it booted me out for a second, so I did miss some of what you were speaking about there, but I got the tail end, and I can speak to the difference between the two mapped sage grouse habitats. And basically, without getting into really kind of the details of how those are modeled and mapped, PHMA and GHMA both are within the overall range for greater sage grouse, and PHMA is essentially the areas within that overall range that have been identified as having the highest conservation value to maintain sustainable greater sage grouse populations. Typically, they include multiple seasonal habitats, including breeding, late brood rearing, and winter concentration areas. And then essentially the general habitat management areas are the remaining portions of overall range that have not been identified as priority habitat, if that helps somewhat.
Commissioner McGowan?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Elm. Could you explain to me the considerations that CPW makes to help protect those two different types of areas, and then how it relates to an application for oil and gas development?
Sure. Yeah. So both habitats are considered high priority habitats within our overall, suite of wildlife habitats. The priority habitat management areas were incorporated in the 1200 series into the 1202D category of habitats. Those, as you know, are wildlife habitats that trigger considerations for density of facilities, and also may trigger requirements for compensatory mitigation to offset impacts. And so that's generally how CPW addresses concerns with those priority habitat management areas. The general habitat falls into really under the 300 series, what triggers a consultation with CPW if there's disturbance within those mapped habitats. So in this case, I think it's important to note that these locations, since they are not within high priority habitat, CPW actually did not conduct a formal consultation with Laramie on these locations. Laramie did reach out, outside of that formal consultation process, and we did have some informal discussions regarding best management practices and some of the development considerations.
Commissioner McGowan?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Elm. So I don't know if you heard the public testimony earlier. I think there were some concerns about the noise level, and because the proposed locations fall outside of high priority habitat, is there then the assumption that there isn't a concern about the noise level? I'm wondering if you could address those comments and your thoughts about that.
Yeah, certainly. Obviously, as the public commenters indicated, the noise, can emanate into adjacent habitats, and that could be a concern. In this instant, with the development, we looked at a lot of different factors, and one of the largest factors here is our Greater Sage-Grouse researcher, Brett Walker, for the Roan Plateau area, has done extensive research and marking of sage-grouse in this area and this population. And we really do not have evidence that this area receives a whole lot of use by greater sage-grouse. And so that was really kind of one of the primary factors that went into our decision on making or not making the recommendation for tighter noise limits, is we just really don't have evidence that grouse are using that adjacent general habitat to a high degree. And, therefore, without the birds being there, we determined that those impacts should be fairly negligible.
Thank you. I don't have any more questions right now.
Commissioner Messner?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And this is because Mr. Elm was talking last, I'm going to ask a question to Mr. Elm. But was CPW consulted by the BLM as part of their environmental assessment for at least one of these locations?
Thank you, Commissioner Messner. So the on-sites that occurred for these were quite some time ago, and I was trying to remember what our role was kind of in the development of the EA and providing input on that. And I believe we provided some informal comments to BLM biologists via email. I do not have those on hand. I would have to find those or get those from BLM. But we, to my knowledge, did not submit a formal written comment on the EA.
Okay. And then understanding that while these proposed sites are not directly in high priority habitat, but are at least some of them are adjacent to the high priority habitat, at least what I'm hearing from some of the public commenters is concern around noise. And understanding that the local government has placed a land use designation on this site that would allow for additional noise designations than perhaps would be considered in a rural area as part of our regulations. I assume at some point, even though there may not be significant sage-grouse populations associated with these particular areas, there's still consideration of that high priority habitat and the potential noise impacts that could occur there. Do you, I guess my question is, do you feel comfortable with those elevated noise allowances versus something closer to the noise allowances that would typically be allowed in a rural area?
Yeah, thanks. Great question. The input that I've received from our subject matter experts indicates that we would be comfortable with those elevated noise levels. And there's several other factors that go into that decision. One being, we would anticipate the highest level of noise, during drilling and completions. That should be fairly short-lived when you look at kind of the life of the facilities. Another factor that we looked at is noise impacts to the nearest lekking areas. There is, as the commenters alluded to, there is significant research on potential impacts to sage grouse while lekking and potential for anthropogenic noise to mask calls and affect kind of the breeding behavior. The nearest pad location in this OGDP is just over 2 miles from the nearest active lek. And so based on what CPW has kind of seen in some past sound modeling, especially in areas like this with the topography and the vegetation that's present, the sound attenuation or the drop off of that noise over that distance is not a big concern for us as far as impacts to the actual lekking area. And so that was kind of another factor in that decision as well.
And then I think last question, just so I have a better understanding of all of this, I think there was some suggestion as far as timing limitations to activities that may cause either noise or activity around lekking seasons. And now I'm not exactly remembering, but was that for any activity associated with any of the pads or a specific pad, or should that, in your opinion, be applied in order to mitigate any potential impacts?
So I believe the one that you're referring to was a result kind of that informal consultation that I spoke of. And Laramie had agreed to a recommendation that we had provided to them to, and sorry, this was specific to the Annex cuttings management facility.
Yeah.
And the recommendation was during the lekking and breeding period to avoid the heavy equipment operations at that site between the hours of 4 p.m. and 9 a.m. So the allowable hours would be 9 a.m. to 4 p.m. And that's really just to avoid kind of that the noise and disruptive nature of the heavy equipment work during kind of those more sensitive times of day. And I guess to answer your question, I don't know, I guess, if that recommendation would be appropriate for the other locations. As I mentioned, I think the most disruptive periods would be the drilling and completions, and a daily timing limitation on those activities is typically not as feasible once kind of the drilling and completions work begins.
There are times that I've seen in different applications that timing limitations associated with certain times of the year have been applied in order to not impact potential sage grouse lekking situations. Is that ever a consideration in situations like this, even though they're not directly in high priority habitat?
I would say it could be if we had evidence of high use in this area, especially during a particular season, whether that was breeding or winter. That might be an instance where CPW maybe would have requested a consultation in order to talk about the timing of the activities. But as I mentioned, we don't have that evidence of use, and so I think based on that, we wouldn't have grounds in this instance to recommend avoidance of any particular season.
Okay. Mr. Elm, I appreciate you answering my questions. Mr. Chair, I'm going to pause right now, and if folks have questions for Mr. Elm, I'll wait. I do have some questions generally for the applicant.
Commissioner Nanjapa.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you all for the presentation and Mr. Elm for being here as well. Appreciate the questions from the other commissioners. A few of the ones that I had have now been answered. Just on that last point that Commissioner Messner raised, I just wanted to make sure that this is still correct, that there is a seasonal limitation on the Annex cuttings facility of March 1st to July 15th. That I believe there was a recommendation that was incorporated, and I just wanted to confirm that that is correct to help reduce impacts during the lekking period.
And I would defer to Mr. banker on exactly the implementation of that recommendation, but that is correct. The dates that you indicated, and that applies to those hours of operations that I mentioned would occur within that date range.
Okay, thank you so much, Mr. Elm. And Mr. Bankert, is that correct? You are incorporating that, the avoidance in the ACF of the heavy equipment use during March to July?
Thank you, Commissioner. Yes, that was as part of our wildlife protection plan for that Annex cuttings facility.
Okay. Okay, thank you. And then apologies for going back and forth here. Mr. Elm, I just wanted to, there was a couple of comments from our public commenters about juvenile recruitment back to the LEC sites, given disturbance in the area. You know, I know you kind of answered a little bit about the overall use of the area, that you had fewer concerns. I was just curious if you could comment a little bit on that as well.
Thank you, Commissioner. That is my understanding of the literature that's been conducted, or the studies that have been conducted, is that one of the measures that we typically look at with sage grouse and impacts is LEC attendance, and that is typically, you know, what we count in the spring. We go out and count the number of birds attending a LEC site, and so it's something that can be measurable over time. And my understanding of a lot of the literature on sound impacts has shown that excessive anthropogenic noise can have an effect over time on attendance at those LEC sites.
Okay, thank you. And another, well, just in general, I think, you know, so I have a little bit of understanding of kind of all the work that's gone into greater sage grouse all throughout the range, and, you know, all the efforts, all the money, all of the, you know, management plans, et cetera, that has been invested in greater sage grouse. And I know that Colorado's been a big part of it, and there's also been, in general, I think, you know, greater sage grouse are doing a little bit better in Colorado than they are in some other parts of the range. As I understand it, is that correct to your knowledge, or have you observed increases in overall numbers, or are you still observing declines, or can you comment a little bit on the overall status?
I would hate to comment too far, especially range-wide outside of Colorado. What I do know in Colorado, and as you're aware, sage grouse populations are cyclical in nature, and so they often peak followed by a decline. I think in general in Colorado, we are kind of in the process of coming out of a recent decline. And so I think the general trend is increasing right now. But, you know, I would defer to our actual experts on that to make kind of more specific comments on where we're at currently with that.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that. Didn't mean to put you completely on the spot there, but you know, I am sort of trying to think about this in terms of the overall impacts, you know, given the concern about this species kind of, you know, range wide, but especially, of course, in Colorado. There was one other question I had. Let's see. Okay, no, I apologize. I think that's all I have for now, but I had a separate unrelated question, but I'll step back in case any others have questions for Mr. Elm or others.
Further questions? Commissioner Messner, did you want to follow back up then?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I've got some general questions here just so that I better understand the application, and so this will be for the applicant. And it's going to be a little bit all over the place, so I apologize in advance. But so one of the sites that's being contemplated here, while most of the sites are on existing well pad locations, one of them is contemplating a new well pad location And I've read the application and I understand the rationale behind utilizing a new well pad location as potentially minimizing impacts. And so I don't have a question about that. My question is how the existing well pad is going to be handled as far as interim reclamation and kind of how these things tie together. I understand there's an access road existing that's anticipated over the existing well pad in order to access the new well pad, but understanding that the existing well pad has a pretty significant footprint. I just didn't fully understand how interim reclamation would be addressed in that situation.
Thank you, Commissioner. So the existing well pad is an older well pad, and it has some interim reclamation on it. Any disturbance that we create on that well pad when we install the road and pipeline through it will be interim reclaimed as part of the new pad program. So once we get it installed, we'll do the reclaim on it and, you know, do the vegetation, the stormwater BMPs, and interim reclaim that portion of the pad, or re-interim reclaim it, I guess is what be the phrase be.
So shorten the footprint down to essentially around where the access road would be. Is that what I'm understanding?
Well, the footprint of the whole old pad would still be the same. We're just trying to keep the road inside that existing footprint. So what we would do, well, I guess you'd say we would shorten smaller, lesser the footprint of the pad and basically use the footprint of the new road as part of the new pad, I guess. I would say I would incorporate the footprint of the road into the new pad and not the old pad.
Okay.
But it would all be interim reclaimed at the same time, so.
Okay. So next question is, what is the anticipated life of the cutting site? Understanding that you've got an anticipated life of the wells associated with it. So I imagine there's some similarities, but I think just generally I was curious about the anticipated life of the cuttings site.
Sure, we anticipate the cuttings life to be approximately 3 to 5 years. So once we get done drilling our last well in our project, we would reclaim those cuttings. And then once those cuttings met COGCC standards or requirements, then we would close that site and reclaim it. So we're looking at a 3 to 5 year life, and up there vegetation takes probably 3 to 5 years to actually really establish. So I would say the site would probably be fully revegetated in probably 3 to 5 years after closure. So, yeah.
So as part of your application, you're asking for some variances associated with a couple of sites. And I wonder if you could just go over how you feel like those variances meet the standards associated with our variance process. There are 5 different standards that are required for a variance process, and you know, there was some discussion of it in the variance request and in the application, but I guess it wasn't particularly clear to me how you met those standards in the variance process. And I'm not talking about the lesser impact area, that's got a different standard. I'm talking specifically about the variances.
David, do you want to take that, or?
I think a good place to start would be the Annex cuttings facility. We're talking about 2 variances there, from one involving a fence or a containment variance. Wayne, perhaps you could talk about that one first.
Sure. Well, on that one, we were talking with the CPW for fencing, as fencing requirements as part of a Form 28 process for a centralized E&P waste facility. And because this site is actually a 3-sided site with a wide opening that would be open for a truck and an ingress egress, with discussions with the CPW, we felt, and with consensus with them, that it would be better for the wildlife to not fence it where they could get trapped or inside it, and allow them to flow back and forth through the site. These sites are in this cuttings management area, even though it's permitted as a centralized E&P waste facility, just because we're hauling material from one site to another. It's really just the same as a well pad, which we don't fence. We just allow wildlife to, travel back and forth as they will around it. So the main thing was try not to trap wildlife inside the facility. And so we discussed this with the CPW, and basically they concurred with that.
And circling back to the 5 factors, this is, of course, a facility that would be constructed and ordinarily would have that sort of containment. As you can see from the presentation, there'll be berms and so forth surrounding the location as the cuttings are placed in it. And I think the thought was that this is a situation where our good faith effort to comply with the intent of the act is to benefit wildlife. And the thought process, if I understand it, Mr. Banker, was that wildlife would be better off without that fence or other means of keeping the public out as opposed to having the fence in place.
Correct. As you've seen from our presentation, this area is secured. We have the gated access, so there is no public access other than authorized personnel. And so there would be no public access. So we weren't concerned about public more than we were about the wildlife and the impacts to them. So.
Then the second, and I think that goes really to all 5 factors, that general consideration that we're better promoting the intent of the act in the planning here if that particular requirement is subject to a variance to as deemed by the commission. Then second, there's a variance with respect to the fire lane that would be required under the rules. Perhaps you could just briefly explain that, Mr. Bankert, and how that better impacts, how that better serves the purposes of the act, and also the consultation you did with local fire district on that.
Yeah, we did a lot of consultation with the local fire district and basically explained our process for them and how we would keep vegetation out. You can see the natural vegetation, and by using a vegetation barrier or prevent a vegetation encroachment, they felt that a fire lane was not necessary as long as you managed, vegetation and like weed control, et cetera, around that site. And so they agreed or concurred that a fire lane was not necessary for this site, which is basically a 10-foot access around the site.
And then I think going to the factors under Rule 502, this is something that, again, is something that's planned. I think the thought process is that will minimize impact to the area, as you could see from the video that was shown and the depictions of what the facility will look like as it's constructed. An additional fire lane would simply cause more impact and wouldn't be helpful in that situation given the limited vegetation that is present in that location. And so I think that satisfies the different 5 factors. Then the additional variances relate to the 2141 pad. That was the one that Mr. Bankert had talked about, that oil and gas operations were planned on that pad, but due to the pandemic in 2020, and they had been permitted, Form 2s and Form 2As had been issued. Due to the pandemic and economic conditions and other factors in 2020, those drilling operations were not conducted. And as depicted on the timeline from Mr. Bankert, at about that time, Laramie undertook an analysis of how they could better drill this area and minimize impact. And that resulted in the plan in front of you. So the variances that are sought there are with respect to the specific interim reclamation and final reclamation variances subject to the approval of this plan. In essence, we're saying there's a better use for that existing pad that we had intended to drill 16 wells on. The plan is to drill more wells and minimize impact to the area overall, and that would serve the 5 purposes under Rule 502.
Thank you for the answers to those questions. I appreciate that. I think I have one other question, and this is going to be around noise. And I believe And give me just a second here. I'm looking at a document here, but my understanding is that you've provided a noise mitigation plan, and you've estimated some different sound levels associated with operations at different times. And even though there perhaps may be additional allowances associated with the local government's land use designation, it appears to me, if I'm reading this correctly, that your anticipated sound levels generally stay within the commercial agricultural levels associated with our 400 series rules. Is that true? And is that something that you think will be ground truth as you do your analysis?
Katie, could you respond to that, please?
Hello, my name is Katie Middleton. Thank you, Commission, for allowing me to speak on behalf of Laramie Energy. I am with Entrada Consulting Group. Just to clarify, so Garfield County for land use change development codes in the past have accepted the light industrial level for any facilities or locations that required a land use change application permit in the past. So I think from the public comment, there was maybe a misunderstanding about land use designation and applied noise levels. So just to clarify for the record, we have from two of the locations are on a private property owned by Laramie, and the other two are owned by another private landowner. That landowner has given us permission to operate at the industrial level. At this point, we do anticipate noise levels to be within the agriculture noise levels at the distances provided in the noise mitigation plan.
Okay. Thank you for answering my questions.
Commissioner Nanjapa?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I did realize I had another question related to the sage grouse issues. This one for Mr. Bankert, since you mentioned that you had been in contact with BLM recently, and I know that we're waiting on the decision. It sounds like you said, I believe, that it is completed and in review. Have any concerns been raised to you regarding potential results of this environmental assessment?
Thank you, Commissioner, for the answer and or question. Sorry. And no, I have not seen any concerns that's raised other than just minor issues like they have questions, but nothing that is like impactful or will require a significant impact analysis. So I don't foresee a decision record that is going to deny the project. And based on my conversations with the BLM, with the natural resource specialist preparing the EA or her manager, I have not seen anything that is a negative decision. Even though unfortunately they have to be careful because they can't be pre-decisional until the record of decision is written. But no, I have not seen anything right now, or I haven't had any communications with them that would make it seem to be denial for those project areas.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that. And that was a question related to the finding of significant, if there was any indication of a finding of significant impact.
Right.
So it sounds like, as far as you understand now, that is not being communicated, but we also don't have their final decision, correct?
No. I do know that I just got an email back from the BLM, and they're still working on it. But like I say, it's going to go to review. The staff has already completed it, and now they're just doing the final review. And so I don't anticipate for as many because I used to work for the BLM, and as many years as I've done this, I don't see this as being a denial. In my opinion, it's not a significant change. It's It's a one single well pad, 3 wells off an existing well pad. So it's not a huge, what I would say, analysis compared to some of the large plans of developments that I've done with the BLM.
Okay, thank you. And you said end of March is the approximate timeframe they're anticipating the decision?
Yes, they said mid to late March. Yes.
Mid to late March. Okay, thank you.
Mhm.
Commissioner McGowan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I'm just going to apologize for this question because this application for me was read a little ways back and we've been doing financial assurance and I feel like my brain is a little muddled. For the waste management facility, could you remind me, the cuttings will be taken to the facility and then they'll be taken from the facility to a larger waste management facility, or will they be left there and then buried? I can't remember. And I'm trying to remember why you're proposing this versus just trucking it and taking it to an appropriate facility, and why one is better than the other.
Sure. I think in our presentation, I'm not sure if you've seen the cuttings management area would be just, we would take excess drill cuttings from our well pads to that area, treat them and encapsulate them there at that management area. And so it would just be a trip up there. The reason that we thought this would be a better option than to hauling them is the nearest facility is 20 and a half miles away. And it would be a lot more impacts to the public and to the town of Quebec. If we were to haul this material, it would be roughly 1,000 semi-truckloads that we would have to haul to the facility. For each truck, it only carries about 18 yards to haul. And so we was trying to see what would minimize the impacts to the public roads, of course, and then to the town of Quebec. And so the biggest way to do it, the best way to do it was just have a small facility on the mountain adjacent to these locations and treat and encapsulate the drill cuttings there. So.
Okay, thank you. That's what I thought, but I just
Sure.
wasn't sure of myself.
Right.
So, and you will be applying for a permit for that facility. You don't have the permit yet, is that correct?
No, yes, we've filed the Form 28 application for a centralized E&P waste management facility. I believe we submitted that in March of 21 of this year. And so it is in the process. It'll be a Form 4 process. And so OGCC staff, your commission staff, is reviewing that plan right now, or application. And so we've been doing a lot of interactions with them. You know, they've sent us comments, we've responded back, et cetera, working on that plan. So.
Okay, so as part of that, there will be an assessment of the drill cuttings and whether they meet, I think it's our table something 915. And is the facility going to be lined, or do you expect that the drill cuttings will be benign enough so that it won't require some sort of special liner, and we feel confident that it's far enough away from any water table? Could you just kind of address some of those?
Sure, of course. First of all, these drill cuttings are just freshwater based. They're not oil-based drill muds. I'm pretty sure you've already seen that over on the eastern slope. These drilling muds or drill cuttings, and what we drill with is freshwater drilling mud, and with a little bit of clays in it for hole stabilization. When the cuttings come out, they're not, what we're bringing over to the cuttings is not any different that we would have on like a well pad. They are just excess cuttings that can't be stored on a well pad. And well pads, we do not require, their liners not required on the well pads also for drill cuttings management. And so we felt that this site did not require the same, did not require a liner just because of the same reasoning. However, as part of our Form 28 process, we are going to install monitoring wells around the site to monitor any groundwater that might happen chance to be there. So we do have taken that into account and have proposed groundwater monitoring wells around that facility. So
thank you.
Commissioner Najapa.
you, Mr. Chair. Just a couple additional questions. One of the public commenters raised that there had been some NOAVs, I believe, at other locations, and in particular one that involved a leak. Without getting into the merits of the discussion, since that might be something that would come before us, I just wanted to ask about the status of those, if you could comment.
Sure, I think this, I was looking for that response letter, but I have so many documents in front of me, I can't find it. Yes, there was a issue, I believe it was in 2008, 2009, of a contamination of a spring. Originally, the site was part of the investigation, but it was in 2011, it was eliminated and identified as not being contributor to the contamination. And so there is documents in there. I'm sorry, I don't have them on record. I think Katie could probably present them to you if you need them here. But so we did an extensive analysis of that. We went through the record review of the entire project to make sure that we were not impacting anything on that original spill or leak contamination, spring contamination. So.
Okay, thank you very much. And then, sorry, Ms. Middleton, I saw you raise your hand.
Hi, yes. Prior to submitting our Form 28 application, we did a historical narrative and researched all the past analytical results from that NOAV. And the Annex cuttings facility location was not considered the source of contamination. And then there was an order 1V365 that said that Laramie was not or Occidental, who is the past landholder for that location, that the site was not responsible.
Okay, thank you for that. And let's see, there was a particular inspection in December of 2020 where a leak was found. So this sounds like something a little more recent. And that's the one more in particular that I'm looking at. It's let's see. It's for Cascade Creek 697351D and 69703670D. And I believe there was a tank that was observed to be leaking. So that's the particular status I'm interested in understanding.
Sure, I can't tell you the specifics on that exactly, well, I'd have to do the research on that. But I do know we do have some occasional tank leakage, and what we do is we have been repairing those tanks, replacing those tanks, replacing the containment, and remediating any sites such as that. And so I can't tell you the specifics. I don't have that right in front of me on which site that would be, but yes.
Okay, thank you. And then the last question regarding Commissioner McGowan's question about the permit for the EMP facility, EMP waste facility. Do you, if it is not approved as an EMP waste facility, is your only alternative to truck it out? What did you say, 28 miles or something? Or what are your other options?
Well, because of the size of the locations, as you've seen from the photos, to expand those locations would be pretty significant, impacts. And so our only option would be to haul it to the nearest EMP facility, waste management facility, which is the Greenleaf site, 28.5 miles away. So that is why we're trying to avoid that at all costs if we can. So.
Thank you. Appreciate that. And I wonder if I could ask Director Murphy if we know the approximate time frame for that decision, if that's appropriate.
Commissioner Nanjapa, would perhaps Sabrina Trask, Ms. Trask, be someone that you would like to hear from?
Sure, thank you very much. That would be helpful.
Give us a sec to bring Ms. Trask to the table.
Good morning, commissioners. Can you hear me okay? Okay, so yes, the Form 28 has been submitted. I have not reviewed it. It is not something that the Planning and Permitting Unit reviews. It is in the Environmental Unit shop, and I believe that Alex Fisher has been working on that particular form. I don't know the timing that Alex might. I don't know if he's probably not available for this hearing today, but I do know that he has been working on it for quite a long period of time. And yeah, I apologize. I don't know when that form might be approved.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate your coming into the panel and helping us to understand the status. That's all I have for now.
Commissioner Ninjapa, I could add a little light to that. Actually, it's Alex Fisher and Stephen Arauza. And I think Stephen Arauza is the main person that we are working with for that Form 28 application. So.
Thank you.
Mr. Messner?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So just a couple of other questions and or considerations that I'd like to ask the applicant. So having reviewed the noise mitigation plans and understanding what the anticipated noise levels are, also understanding in the noise mitigation plan what is being claimed as allowable maximums under industrial land use designation. I wonder if the applicant, because the concerns we're hearing, at least in my interpretation of them, revolve predominantly around noise and potential impact to greater sage grouse associated with noise. I certainly heard from Mr. Elm that there was some consideration of whether or not there was significant greater sage grouse populations in the adjacent high priority habitat areas, but still acknowledging that these are mapped high priority habitat areas and there is proximity of these sites to those. I wonder if there would be a consideration of accepting a lower overall allowance than industrial in this particular application as a best management practice, understanding that the anticipated noise levels, as at least I believe I'm reading in the noise mitigation plan, lie just above agricultural and certainly within the light industrial range.
I guess I couldn't respond to that. We try to minimize our noise as much as we can, no matter what kind of equipment we use. And so I can just base what we had on our noise mitigation plan on some on-site that we did on some of our other off-site. Like I think if you look at our noise mitigation plan, we did do some field measurements of those sites, but I can't tell you right now about agreeing to a BMP that would actually lower that sound decibel level. I'm not a noise person. I'd have to go back with my people and see if it's possible.
Ms. Middleton, I believe you did the noise mitigation plan. Are you concerned that the levels that you've anticipated in there are not accurate?
Hello. So we had the noise generation that we used in this were provided by the drilling company and the completions companies. So we are anticipating to go out, take ambient background noise levels and take noise levels while drilling and completions is being conducted. Just due to equipment variabilities based on equipment availability, and due to that we were provided noise levels provided by companies, we want to make sure that when we go out there that we are meeting the noise standards. So we will be taking noise measurements and collecting sound levels during operations. to verify our anticipated noise levels.
So just so I understand, I mean, I guess I had made a suggestion that a potential way of mitigating some potential concerns we're hearing from folks is to accept a lower noise level than industrial. And I think what I hear you saying is the answer is no.
I would not want to speak on behalf of Laramie on that. What I can just say is that we were given noise data by the companies. And so I would not want to, I would want to make sure when the actual operations are being conducted to see what the noise levels are. I believe that at 500 feet, we could meet the light industrial level, but that's going off of numbers that the companies have provided.
Okay, I'll let you think about that one for a second. My other question is understanding that we don't have the environmental assessment associated with some of these, and typically in my experience reading environmental assessments, there's some condition of approvals that are associated with those. And without knowing what those conditions of approval are, I wonder if you would be okay including an element within the approval or a possible approval of this application that included adoption of whatever conditions of approval are associated with the BLM environmental assessment.
I think that's a reasonable, I mean, anything that BLM puts on a condition of approvals, we usually, we try to incorporate in all our project areas. So I don't see that as a something that we could not do.
Okay. All right, thank you.
Any further questions of the panel? Okay, thank you very much. I appreciate the panel being before us and presenting to us. Appreciate my fellow commissioners' questions. I believe we can allow the panel to zoom away and we will turn it back to commissioners for deliberation. And we've been going at it for about an hour and 50 minutes. Why don't we take a 10-minute break and return at 11? All right, welcome back, commissioners. We have now heard from the public. We've heard from our operator, heard from the operator, and heard from our staff. I think it's now time for deliberation, if we so desire. Does anybody want to lead off? Commissioner Nanjapa?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I didn't really want to lead off, but nobody was volunteering. So I think in general, I think that the application has been well prepared. I appreciated the consultations with CPW, despite the fact that there was that the locations are not within high priority habitat, and the considerations with respect to the limitations of the heavy equipment use during the lecking season at the cuttings facility. And obviously, given the location, there's not a major concern of any human receptors and impacts, to residential areas, et cetera. So that is a lesser concern, and I think the general lesser impact decision, I think, is appropriate. Overall, my biggest concern, I think, is knowing that the environmental assessment from BLM is coming in just a matter of weeks. And I think that that would be a useful bit of additional information for us with respect to this. I also note that the BLM is in the middle of a broader land use assessment for the greater sage grouse. And that's in progress now. Comments were just due back in early February. And so that process is ongoing, and that may or may not impact anything with this site and with our particular decision. But I do think that given those kinds of considerations, my general inclination is to postpone decision until we can receive the BLM environmental assessment, and to be able to ensure that they did have a finding of no significant impact, and that you know, if there's any conditions that they're incorporating, that we can reference those in any decision that we make. Generally speaking, though, as I said, I think that the overall considerations and the explanations that were provided, I feel were satisfactory, and I appreciate, you know, some of the additional steps that were taken with respect to kind of considering impacts overall, and I don't have major concerns other than what I just noted.
Commissioner McGowan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Commissioner Nanjapa, for your thoughts. I guess I need to understand. I'm not sure I agree that we need to wait and see how the federal EA comes out, because I think that the operator, if I understand how this would work, would have to meet any conditions that were in the EA. And so I guess I feel confident that BLM, if they have any conditions that come out of the EA, they'll hold the operator to those conditions. And so I'm not sure what benefit we have or what would change if something came out of the EA. I am interested in a discussion of whether or not we could try to minimize noise as much as possible, even though it is zoned for a higher level, understanding that there is sensitive habitat in the area, even though it's outside of, you know, the operator, I think, was careful to choose sites that are outside of the actual high priority habitat map. I'm also appreciative that they're using existing sites that have already been disturbed. They're not coming in and disturbing something new. It already exists there, which I, from a cumulative impacts perspective, find important. So I would be interested in having a discussion about noise levels with the operator. But otherwise, I'm satisfied that I think they've done everything within our rules to mitigate. And I was most concerned about the wildlife and high priority habitat issues. And I feel like our CPW person, Mr. Elm, did a good job of explaining that process and what the concerns are or are not from our state sister division. So
Commissioner Messner, then Commissioner Gonzalez.
Commissioner Gonzalez can go first.
Thanks, Commissioner Messner, and thanks for your comments, Commissioner Nanjapa, Commissioner McGowan. You know, having read through this and heard the presentation today, I don't have any significant concerns with this application. I appreciate the thorough review as presented through the director's recommendation and all the back and forth as identified on the Form 2A that's online in our system. You know, I don't, when, you know, in thinking about the timing of the EA, you know, I think about that as being part of the BLM process, right? And the BLM has a thorough process of vetting wells and part of their permitting process for lands and minerals that are developed under their authority. That is not in our rules, right? And that is something that, sure, we can require, we can really require anything sitting here in these seats, but I have big concerns about kind of moving the goalposts on what our rules say is required, folks who are complying with those rules, folks who have a thorough engagement with COGCC with the BLM and really on a voluntary basis with CPW in this case. And so I'm not interested in delaying this further, nor am I interested in putting additional just COAs that have been recommended by public comments. We're outside high priority habitat. Is it close to where it's mapped? Yes. Is close defined in our rules? Is close something that we're trying to regulate? I get concerned if we start doing this, at what point is there a cutoff, right? At what point does an operator come before us and not know what that finish line looks like, not know what that goal looks like, and really, just comes before us and everything to me seems kind of buttoned up, and I'm just weary of kind of placing these ad hoc additional requirements on an application that meets all of our rules and is protective according to the rules that we put in place. So I'm in support of this application, and that's where I sit on it.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate the other commissioners' comments on this. I would agree that I think generally this application was well written, and the information that was provided to me was clear. I asked some clarifying questions today to make sure that I fully understood some of the different elements of the application. I think for this commissioner, even though there was no formal consultation with CPW, which just on the side is something that I think formal consultations in situations like this seem appropriate, but I understand that it's not required in the rules, so that's a consideration for another time. But because as a non-wildlife expert, that consultation is incredibly important to me, and the information that is provided by CPW in relation to wildlife is incredibly important to me, which is why I asked specific questions associated about sage grouse to Mr. Elm. I think that noise is an important consideration here. I think that there's a challenge between the allowable uses or the allowable levels of noise in an industrial area versus an allowable noises in an agricultural or rural area. I think when I think about this particular area, I certainly don't consider it an industrial area, but I also understand what our rules say. I think that in asking Mr. Elm from CPW, the requirements are not the requirements, his opinion associated with potential impacts to elevated noise levels in this particular area, when I heard that from our wildlife professionals standpoint, that those were minimum. I certainly made the suggestion to the operator that based on their noise mitigation study, that it seems like a lower allowable use could alleviate some potential concerns from some of the citizens that we heard. It seemed like a reasonable request. It did not appear that they were interested in doing that. I don't find the ability within our rules for me to require that. Although I still wish that there would be some consideration of that by the operator, because to me, based on their noise mitigation study, that is a reasonable request. I do think generally the variances meet our standards. I do think that the lesser impact areas meet our standards, and I see that Mr. Little just showed up, so perhaps you have a comment.
Is it all right if I comment, commissioners?
Please do.
During the break, we did have a chance to talk some more about the noise issues, and Katie Middleton could perhaps address some of your concerns, Commissioner.
Why don't we bring Ms. Middleton back to the panel?
And we may bring Wayne Bankert back too.
Why don't we do that just in an abundance of caution?
Hello, thank you, Chair. During our discussions, Laramie believes that they will be able to meet the agriculture level, and we will monitor sound. We will do a background ambient sound prior to any drilling activities, and then during drilling operations and completions operations, we will conduct noise collection studies to confirm that we are meeting the agriculture standard at 350 feet from the edge of disturbance.
Thank you, Ms. Middleton. From this commissioner's standpoint, I think that's a really good addition to your application, and I think shows that you're willing to accept responsibility for the noise and for meeting certain noise standards. And I think that's a really positive step. So I appreciate that consideration. And so I'll continue with my comments on this. If the applicant is willing to include that as a best management practice, I fully support that and encourage that. I think that as far as the BLM environmental assessment, I also heard that the applicant is willing to incorporate compliance to the whatever conditions of approval are associated with those into this particular application as well. I think that just gives us the ability to be consistent as we look at the site. And if the applicant's willing to do that, I think that's also shows a strong willingness to be as minimizing of impacts in this particular situation as they can. And so I would appreciate that. So generally speaking, I would support this application with those suggested BMPs by the operator and go from there.
Thank you, Commissioner Messner. I'm in agreement that this application is approvable. I would be in agreement with the two additions as noted by the applicant. I rely in large part on our CPW colleague and the subject matter experts there who testified that noise would not be a problem here. I think the applicant has done a good job of finding locations outside of high priority habitat. I think the use of existing sites is a positive development. I'm in agreement with Commissioner Gonzalez about sort of adding on to conditions beyond our rules. And I would like to also speak to the folks that were concerned that because this is the first OGDP on the West Slope near sage grouse, that somehow or another what we do here will be precedent for future work that we're going to be doing. And that is absolutely not the case. Each application is looked at independently. It is assessed based upon its own merits. And I think that's an important point to make so that folks do not feel that somehow or another today's work is going to impact tomorrow's work. So those are my comments. Commissioner Najapa, then Commissioner Messner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I meant to include the comments that Commissioner Messner made about noise, but I'm very appreciative of Laramie being willing to reduce that noise threshold with a BMP. I think if we can incorporate that as well, that goes a long way. And I also appreciate Commissioner Gonzalez's comments that there is no requirement in our rules to we don't have co-equal authority with BLM with respect to approvals. And so I understand that as well. And I agree with the comments that Commissioner McGowan made as well, that it's that they will have to comply with the BLM's environmental assessment conditions. If there is a way to incorporate some language per Commissioner Messner's suggestion related to that, that adds a little degree of comfort for me, but otherwise I appreciate those considerations. And, I think overall, this is a good application, as has been pointed out. It is not in high priority habitat, and that makes a big difference overall for me, including the comments from Mr. Elm. So I'm comfortable with those additions as discussed.
I think we're about to see Commissioner Messmer artfully produce a motion that includes the COAs.
Artful is a tough thing for me, but I'll certainly make an effort. And I'll point out that these are not COAs, they're BMPs. My understanding is the operator has agreed to these. And so my motion will be the approval. And I've got to pull up the docket numbers if we want to include the docket numbers in this.
It's docket number 2108-00138.
Okay. So I move approval of the previously stated docket number for this particular OGDP with the addition of the 2 BMPs agreed to by the applicant. And I'll try to clarify those, and we can have discussion after the motion if I did not, in other commissioners' opinion or the applicant's opinion, get them correct. But that the applicant is willing to maintain a maximum noise threshold of the allowable agricultural level within our 400 series rules, and that the approval of this OGDP application include a requirement that the applicant meet any conditions of approval associated with the BLM environmental assessment for the sites associated with this application.
Second.
Before we move to further discussion on motion, AG Davenport has appeared. I didn't know if he had anything to add.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I don't really have anything to add. I did note that I'm not sure if Mr. Trask just appeared or came back. I hope that's clear enough for staff. The motion is, given that they will be the ones incorporating it in the permit and enforcing it.
And that was the reason we elevated Ms. Trask back to the panel. Is the motion clear enough for you and your team to incorporate into the permit?
I believe so. I think that staff's preference would be that we work with the applicant to craft BMPs for both of these issues rather than the use of COAs. And based on Ms. Middleton's comments, I believe that Laramie is willing to work on those BMPs with staff.
Okay, great. Got fruit flies flying all over me. I just ate one.
And on behalf of Laramie, we're very willing to work with staff to talk about how to articulate what Ms. Middleton discussed.
Okay, we have a motion and a second. We've got direction from the applicant and from staff. Is there further questions or deliberation? Seeing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye.
Aye.
Opposed, motion carries. Thank you very much, Mr. Little, Ms. Middleton, Mr. Bankert. We appreciate you being with us this afternoon or this morning. And we will now turn to our next agenda item. Okay, we now will take up docket number 2106-00096. This is Vecta Oil and Gas Limited. And it's the Salmons Oil and Gas Development Plan. We do not have public comment signed up for this, so we will not have a public comment portion to this OGDP consideration. We will have a presentation from Vecta. I see that Mr. Little is attorney of record and he remains with us. Welcome back, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you again, commissioners. If I could ask that Matthew Goolsby, Bill Untied, and Gwen Brodsky be made panelists. On behalf of Vector Oil and Gas, Matt Goolsby will be making the presentation in support of the application. And while Mr. Goolsby is getting prepared, Mr. Untied is Vice President of Land for Vector Oil and Gas. Gwen Brodsky is a permitting consultant who is assisting Vector Oil and Gas in this matter. And Matt Goolsby is a geologist and Vice President of Operations for Vector Oil and Gas.
Let me do a sound check and see, can everybody hear me? I can't tell from here.
Yes, we can hear you and we can see you.
All right, very good. Let me share my screen. Thank you, Mr. Little. All right, can everybody see what I'm sharing?
We can see what you're sharing. It's not in screen share mode.
Yes, it's not, in case I'm doing that on purpose, Mr. Chairman, in case I need to go back from one slide to the other, if that's all right with you.
It's totally fine. Just want to make sure you're sharing what you want to share.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, David, and good morning to everybody. My name is Matthew Goolsby, and I'm the Vice President of Vector Oil and Gas. I have a Bachelor of Science in Geology. So in the industry, I would technically be labeled as an operations geologist. I have worked in the energy industry and lived in Colorado for 44 years. The majority of my work has been in Colorado, but I've also worked throughout the United States, especially that western half of the United States, and overseas on 3 different continents. And for 42 years, I have been the co-owner of a geologic consulting firm. And in that role, I have been involved in the geologic and operational aspects of thousands of wells in the state of Colorado alone. This image I have up is a Google Earth Pro image. It's zoomed out to about the same altitude as the International Space Station. It's geo-positioned over the Texas Panhandle with a view from the southeast across the state of Colorado. One of my reasons for having it up here is to just give the commission an idea of where in the great state of Colorado our oil and gas development plan is located. You can see down in the southeast corner of Colorado, the black and yellow circle. That's actually the location, the first location we would drill on the Salmons Ranch oil and gas development plan. It's also up here because it's one of my favorite images. So for almost 13 years now, I've been the VP of operations for Vector Oil and Gas. So just who is Vector Oil and Gas? Well, Vector Oil and Gas is a limited partnership, excuse me, formed in Texas in the year 2000. Vector has been a Colorado operator since the year 2008, when we drilled our first well in Colorado, and we've drilled a total of 22 wells in Colorado. Vector also has a physical presence in Colorado. We opened an office in Lakewood in 2009, and we are still located at that address. Vector is a small company. In the Colorado office, we normally have 4 or 5 people in the office. We're also a financially sound company. Besides Colorado, Vecta operates wells in Wyoming, Montana, and North Dakota. The images I have on this slide are just to illustrate our stewardship on surface lands. This is from a well that's located in central Montana in an area where there's a lot of water produced with the oil and gas. We produce up to 80,000 gallons of fresh water per month from this well. And the water needs to be lightly treated to meet the standards of the Montana Department of Environmental Quality. And beyond that, the rule is only that it has to be released into the nearest drainage system, naturally occurring drainage system. But I wanted to point out that Vecta went well beyond that. We ended up hiring an environmental scientist retired from the wastewater plant in Billings, Montana. We had him design and supervise the construction of an outfall, a wetland, and an impoundment. And we fenced that impoundment in to keep the cattle off of it. They have access to the same water downstream about 200 yards. So we're very proud of this construction that we did and the step we took to keep the landowner happy. As she says, it's the nicest spot on her entire ranch. Well, I know this is the third hearing that before the commission regarding helium in Los Animas County. So I have there's a lot of detail on this slide. I'm not going to go into the weeds on this. I did want to give you some idea of what's going on, just what the heck is up with helium right now. Helium is on the United States critical resource list. It has been on that list for about 100 years, ever since right after World War I. Helium is an inert element. It has a very high thermal conductivity. It has the lowest boiling point of any known element at minus 458 degrees Fahrenheit. Helium cannot be synthesized or manufactured. So our only source of helium are natural occurring accumulations. It's a critical resource in very limited supply. One other aspect of helium is that the trapping mechanisms for helium are very similar to those for hydrocarbons. So this makes it an easy pivot for small oil and gas companies like Vecta Oil and Gas to pivot from hydrocarbons toward helium, because the geology and trapping system is very similar to what it is for hydrocarbons. The biggest difference is that helium is a smaller and much lighter molecule than hydrocarbon molecules. And so this means that the seal on top of the trap generally has to be better than it is for hydrocarbons. So just where is all this helium going? Helium is critical to several high-tech industries. The three of the biggest are computers, space industry, and the medical industry. In the computer industry and manufacturing of chips and the growth of silicon crystals and so forth, helium provides an inert atmosphere to make this possible, so it's critical for that industry. And the space industry consumes a great deal of helium. In 2021, there were almost 150 launches to space, and each of these launches consumes a great deal of helium. Mostly it's used as pressure control and as replacement as the fuel drains from the space launches to provide an inert atmosphere and prevent explosions and so forth. The third area is in the medical and superconductivity industry. Because helium has such a high thermal conductivity, it's a supercoolant that's used to keep the magnets cool in these industries. And I would point out that all three of these industries are growth industries with expected growth in the future. On the top right, I have a couple of pie charts. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on that. I just want to point out that the projected consumption of helium for 2022 was 6.6 billion cubic feet. And at this point, because of some mechanical issues and so forth overseas with some of the suppliers, the projected supply is only 6 billion cubic feet. So we're in a demand market at this point. A couple of other things I would point out about helium is in the United States, there's a floor on the price of helium at around $100 a 1,000 cubic feet that stabilizes the helium market in the United States. The reason for this is that it's so costly to transport helium from overseas. The last thing I would point out on this slide that I want you to take away from this is that helium is a non-polluting inert noble gas. Under the conditions found anywhere on Earth, helium will not react with anything at all. Now I want to get into the Salmon's oil and gas development plan proper. In this overview, I want to point out that Vecta is exploring for helium as a primary target. This is a big change in the industry. This is why I emphasize this. This is something that's been taking place over the last half decade or so. In the past, helium has always been considered a byproduct of oil and gas activity. It was a secondary target. Now, companies like Vecta are starting to look at helium as a primary target. We started doing this in 2015 when the market for oil and gas was down and our market for our sales of helium were up in price. So since 2015, we've been looking at helium as a primary target. So it's almost a foregone conclusion that we would end up looking in Los Animas County. The reason for this is there are so many indications in Los Animas County of high percentages of helium found with no associated oil and gas. Vecta and this oil and gas development plan will be using up to 4 shallow vertical wells. These average about 1,400 foot deep. The OGDP is located on private ranch land. It's located in rural eastern Los Animas County, and we're targeting a non-hydrocarbon bearing formation. In the process of the research and exploration we've been doing in Los Animas County, we've looked at the historical well records in about a 60-mile radius from the oil and gas development plan, and also in the historical records of water wells in that area. And nowhere in any of these records did we find any indication of hydrocarbon shows at all from surface down through the Lions Formation, which is our primary target. This is a map view of the oil and gas development plan. And Vecta has 100% interest in this mineral, the 640-acre mineral leasehold. All the development will occur under a surface use agreement with a single surface owner. And Vecta Oil and Gas is proposing to develop up to 4 one-acre locations. If productive, each of these locations will be reclaimed back to 0.2 acres each. Each location will have a single conventional vertical helium gas well. The application lands are unspaced as to the Lions Formation. So this means development will occur under spacing requirements listed in Rule 401.b, which says that wells less than 2,500 feet need to be at least 200 feet from any lease line and at least 300 feet from any other existing or permitted well in the same source of supply. And the leasehold in our oil and gas development plan does meet that criteria. I would also point out just one item on here. We have a well listed just to the west of the oil and gas development plan. That is a water well. And in fact, there's 2 water wells located there because they did not find water on the first well and twinned it. Speaking specifically about the oil and gas locations, these locations use ranch land, which has been previously disturbed by existing dirt roads, grazing, and stock tank construction. The locations do not meet any requirements for alternative location analysis. The nearest residential dwelling is 3/4 of a mile away across Colorado Highway 109. That's located to the southwest of the OGDP. The area does not have any high priority wildlife habitat. The locations are not immediately upgrading from a wetland or riparian corridor. Each well will be drilled with air over the course of 7 to 10 days. And no hydrocarbons or produced water is anticipated on any of these locations based on historical well logs, including the water well historical files. During production, the location equipment will consist only of a wellhead and a 4-inch poly flow line for helium gas. And these flow lines will be buried underneath the access road to reduce surface disturbance. On my last slide, I want to talk a little bit about eastern Los Animas County. So this area gets 14 inches of annual precipitation. That's in a normal year. Right now, there's a bit of a drought going on, and this low precipitation limits the revenue that can be realized from ranching due to concerns of overgrazing. Ranching is the primary economy for eastern Los Animas County. The only source of fresh water for domestic and cattle watering is the Dakota Aquifer, which is sometimes located directly at the location. It does occur at the location on part of our OGDP area. This aquifer extends down to the Morrison Formation between 200 and 300 feet below the surface. Vector recognizes and is committed to protecting this valuable local resource. Our BMP plan for the Dakota Aquifer is to set a 30-foot conductor, drill through the Dakota and 50 feet into the Morrison, and set 8 5/8 surface casing. From there, we will drill down to the top of the Lions Formation and set 5.5-inch production casing. Both these strings and the conductor will be cemented from the casing shoe all the way back to surface. So this valuable aquifer will be protected with at least 2 strings of casing cemented top to bottom. So we feel good about the way we are handling this valuable resource for this area. There's very little surface water in this part of the world. I would also point out that this helium development that we foresee represents an additional commodity for ranchers and mineral owners in the area. Not just for Vecta and not just for these ranchers and mineral owners, but we see it as a economic benefit for all of Los Animas County and indeed for the state of Colorado as well. Vecta is committed to doing this, all our operations in this area in a safe and environmentally responsible manner. That includes my presentation. Mr. Little.
Thank you, Mr. Goolsby. We don't have any further presentation. We're, of course, very willing and able to answer your questions.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the presentation, Mr. Goolsby. Do we have questions? Commissioner Nanjapa?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Little and Mr. Goolsby for your presentation. These helium wells are just really fascinating to me. I appreciate the additional background that you provided as well. I've asked some questions in some of the last helium OGDPs as well, but it's very interesting to me. One thing I was just curious, especially given your pie chart, obviously this is a declining resource and declining pretty quickly here in the US. So how long do you anticipate the life of these wells?
We project them at about 7 to 10 years based on the economics that we've done.
Okay. Okay. I think that was just my biggest question. I think overall, the information you've provided is very helpful. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Other questions? All right, I am not seeing further questions, which means for the most part, you probably did an outstanding job with the presentation. So we appreciate the panel being here with us. Again, we did not have public comment on this, so we have gotten to the deliberation stage for commissioners. Would anybody like to make a motion? Commissioner Gonzalez?
Thanks, Chair. Yeah, I appreciate the presentation. Very thorough. Always interesting to learn about this. What seems to be like a growing helium endeavor as a primary product here in the state. And so, appreciate the presentation, and it was thorough. I appreciate the director's recommendation and the thorough summary of the application. In that regard, I'm comfortable with this application, and I would move for approval.
Second.
Very good. We have a motion and a second to approve the application. And that is application 2106-00096. Any further discussion? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carries. Thank you very much. We appreciate you being with us.
Thank you.
Good luck.
Thank you very much.
Commissioners, that concludes the agenda items for us today. Does anybody have anything further? I need to look at something real quick. I was just looking, we do have calendared a work session tomorrow. And the only thing that I would bring to the work session, but it's not right yet, but I just wanted to give you a heads up. I have been having some discussions with some of the West Slope operators about putting together that West Slope working group. I received some information that I have not had a chance to review yet, but I just want to flag it that is still being developed. And in case you wanted to have a meeting to talk about that, I wouldn't really have a whole lot to talk about, but I didn't want there to be a dearth of information there. I don't have anything else, I believe. Given that we've had a heavy workload, I would be comfortable in not having our work session tomorrow, but definitely if other folks have things they want to talk about, we could have the session. Commissioner Messner?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I agree that with not having it tomorrow. I do want to point out that I'm having some conversations about, I think if you all remember from the produced water session that we had a few months back, there was some consideration or discussion around the development of a produced water consortium. And so I've continued having some conversations about that. I'd like to chat with the commission about that at some point. And so next time we have one of these work sessions, I think that would be a topic that I would bring up.
And maybe what I'll do is hopefully Ms. Larson is taking notes, or Ms. Amaro, and then we can make sure that we have a list of topics for the next time we get together. And in the interim, just get to Hearings Manager Larson, other topics, and then we'll have a healthy next work session. It just won't be tomorrow, which is fine because we've got another wrecked weekend ahead of us because we're going to get the red line on tomorrow afternoon. Okay, with that, our business is done. I would look for a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second.
We have a motion in 2 seconds. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
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 Any opposed? We're adjourned. Thanks, everybody.